Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how are you today? In today's video, we are going to continue with We Had Everything But Money, okay? So, there are some things about the Depression, days that you can explain to people who didn't live through them. You can talk about people being out of work and they understand. You can talk about money being scarce and they understand. You can talk about families having fun without spending a lot of money and they sort of understand. But start talking about clothing and you have a big problem. The problem is that people under 45 can't imagine a time before Orlon and rayon and nylon and phony leather and permanent press fabrics. It's a little like trying to explain to a centipede what it's like to have just two legs. I'm convinced that the one big thing we had going for us during the Depression was that none of these test tube marvels had come along yet. There was cotton, and wool, and genuine leather. This was sturdy stuff that could be passed along through a whole generation, unlike most of today's clothing, which seems barely able to make it through a single season. Of course, there are drawbacks. Cotton tended to shrink and in totally unpredictable amounts. Kids did not enjoy this since the prudent mother always bought things at least one size larger than needed because it will shrink some. She always had her eye on saving money, so she bought at least one size larger than needed because you'll grow into it. The upshot of these strategies was that when you saw a kid with new clothes, you saw a lot more clothes than kid. Things generally were dandy the second year, but then took a turn for the worse the third year when cuffs and shirt sleeves were 3 inches short of where they were meant to be. The same thing happened with shoes. Although at least they didn't shrink. I don't know about your family, but in ours, Dad was the boss when it came to shoe buying. He followed the same plan Mom did, buy them a size too big because you'll grow into them. But all this is from a male perspective. Sometimes I think girls had it better. Every Depression, mother knew how to sew. Most were very good at it too, so they take daughters in hand, go to the local dry goods store and pore over the Butterick and Simplicity patterns books until they found the perfect pattern. Then they'd paw through bolt after bolt of yarn goods until they found just the right color and design. Pick out buttons at the button counter, buy a spool of J&P Coats thread, and head on home. Patterns were shuffled and rearranged to get the most efficient use of the material. Leftovers went into the rag bag for future quilts. Pieces were pinned together and tried on, and then the singer was fired up for a flurry of stitching until the custom-made, hand-tailored dress was finished. That's why my sister's clothes always seemed to fit. None of this you'll grow into it stuff. Hems and even seams could be let out next year. Me, I just walked around with pant legs somewhere between my ankles and my knees. Now I ask you, how can a person of the Depression explain this to people of the disposable society who buy their synthetic marvels at Walmart or Kmart and Hope they'll last until spring. How do you explain it to kids who refuse to wear their perfectly good t-shirt on the grounds that last month's rock star is now old hat and no one at school would be caught dead wearing a shirt with his picture on it? How do you explain it to the young parent who shells out $80 for a pair of sneakers that have the life expectancy of an ice cube in a frying pan? You don't. And like they say, you just had to be there. Clancy Strock. So much truth to that. So much truth. During the Depression, when I was growing up, we couldn't afford many store-bought things. I didn't mind that at all because I knew there would be... Sorry, I lost my... That's terrible. I knew there would always be plenty of clothing for Mom and me, made from those pretty sacks that our feed came in. Wow. Imagine that. Imagine wearing clothing made out of potato sacks and stuff like that. Imagine doing that. Can you imagine doing that today, right now? Wow. Mom sewed aprons and nightshirts and pajamas and dish towels and tablecloths, sheets and pillowcases from those feed sacks. If we were lucky enough to get quite a few sacks with the same color and pattern, Mom would make curtains and comforters too. When there was a material bearing at any print Mom didn't like, it went to a special box for use later in weaving rugs. Not all feed sacks were printed though, and when Mom got the plain ones that were light tan, she'd bleach them. The whitest, softest ones were made into warm petticoats and bloomers. Flour sacks were usually white with a simple plaid design. These were softer weave and were very absorbent, so they were packed in the back of our kitchen drawer for use as a special Sunday dish towel. Sugar sacks were smaller, plain white, and made of thinner fabric. They were ideal for straining, crackling from fresh rendered lard. We also used them for straining milk, as drip bags for jelly, and as bandages. We made good use of seed bags too in those days, and seed usually came in cloth bags printed with a bright company logo, and those labels were stubborn and wouldn't always bleach out, so Mom turned them into hand towels for the men. With repeated washing and strong soap, the print usually faded. Factory-made bags were sewed together with sturdy cords that could be unraveled and saved. So we even made secondary use of that string. We used it for mending and patching and tying sausages and even securing bandages. And those sacks were precious to the farm wife. And if she had any she didn't need, she saved them. Even when she and her husband retired from farming and moved to town, any remaining feed sacks went along with her. You can still find them at estate sales, but the bidding is always brisk. Wow. It's just amazing. I can still remember my dad bringing home chicken feed and flour in printed bags and listening to my mother and sisters talk about what to make out of them. When I was a young lad of about 8, Dad was going to pick up 4 flour sacks. He said I could go alone. Mother told me she needed 2 sacks printed with small blue flowers, and that I could pick out 2 other sacks on any pattern I'd liked, because she wanted to make a shirt for me. At the store, I found 2 sacks my mother wanted, but she really got my attention was 2 sacks covered with a print of big yellow daisies. I thought it was the prettiest material I've ever seen. When we got home, I asked Mother to make my shirt from those colorful sacks, but Mother told me that boys just didn't wear loud clothes, and certainly not shirts with yellow daisies on them. She made my sister a blouse from those sacks instead. I was disappointed, but eventually I forgot about it. But Mother never forgot. Many years later, she gave me a patchwork quilt she made. When I opened the gift box, I immediately saw the quilt was made with several squares of that yellow daisy material that I had loved so much. Royce Yergis, Sikeston, Missouri. Wow. I grew up in a small, exclusive suburb. We were considered different in our neighborhood because we had a garden and raised chickens. Who can say how the other kids would have reacted if they had found out my sister and I wore dresses made of feed sack cloth? I never cared because one of the most exciting things for me was to go to the feed store with my father on Saturday mornings. My sister and I would take turns choosing the bags with the designs we liked the most. Whoever picked out the bag got something made out of it. One Saturday, it was my turn to choose the sack, and since it was getting close to the new school year, I thought a new dress for my first day would be nice. I found a beautiful sack that had sky blue background with gorgeous mallard ducks on it. The only trouble was there was only one sack like this. I was getting a little big for a dress made out of just one sack. My mother, being the sewing whiz she was, found a pretty dress pattern and managed to complete the dress out of that one sack by making the sleeves out of white pique. It was the prettiest dress I had ever seen. I was very happy to wear it for the first day of school and many days after that. Florence Davis, Amesbury, Massachusetts. We used feed and flour sacks for bed sheets, pillowcases, curtains, towels, and our apparel, including underwear. On one memorable occasion, our washing machine broke down and it was beyond repair. An enterprising young salesman brought a Maytag washer out to demonstrate its merits. My mother sorted the wash and asked him to start with the sheets and towels, which were all made of feed sacks. At one point, the salesman wanted to wipe his hands. He reached down to the laundry pile and grabbed some white material he thought to be a towel. Much to my mother's embarrassment, he was wiping his hands on her bloomers. Oh my! They just happened to be made out of the same material as the towels and sheets. My sister and I laughed so hard our sides ached. Dorothy Patrick, Shawano, Wisconsin. That is a very funny story. I love that story. I was one of 7 children, and the feed sack was the only fabric our mother had for making our clothes. I never realized how poor we were. I only knew how much fun it was to go into town on a Saturday and look through the new sacks of feed to find patterns Mother and I were fond of. It was such a treat to be able to pick out my very own design. Many years later, my husband and I were visiting the Smithsonian Institution of Washington, D.C. I lingered over one of the exhibits while my husband went ahead. Suddenly, he called back over his shoulder, "Guess what? There's a display up here of feed sack patterns with explanations of how they were made into dresses." Excited, I rushed to join him. To my amazement, hanging there in the exhibit were the 2 patterns Mother had used to make my very favorite dresses. We just seen a display of America's first flag, and that had given me goosebumps. But those were nothing compared to the goosebumps I had gotten when I saw those feed sacks again. What memories. Mrs. Dave Morton, Orlando, Florida. Wow. During the Depression, most of us felt the challenging of making do. One friend's husband was lucky enough to have a job during those years, but his salary was low, so he supplemented the family's income by raising chickens. He bought his chicken feed in large bags made of good cotton muslin, and the back of each sack was printed with a lion's head. My friend was happy whenever her husband emptied those sacks, for this couple had two young small boys. To save money, she used the sacks to make their pajamas. The boys loved them because he cut the material so each pajama top had the lion's head on the back. When some of the family's more affluent relatives brought their small son for a visit, the youngster was so taken with those feed sack pajamas that he began crying. He wanted a lion's head on his pajama top too. The problem was easily solved. Once my friend got a few more empty sacks, in a short time the little cousin had a lion's head pajama all on his own. Mrs. Harry R. McLaughlin, DeRidder, Louisiana. That's awesome. When I was a girl of 9, my favorite feed sack dress was a yellow background with red paisley design. That paisley pattern reminded me of tiny red caterpillars bending to begin spinning their cocoons. I used to daydream and hope that one day those caterpillars would turn into a beautiful crimson butterfly and carry me off into the sky. A mighty accomplishment for a humble feed sack. Susan Katz, Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. My mother made a number of things out of feed sacks, including undergarments. She always bleached the sacks until they were white, but once in a while she'd have trouble getting the printed words out of them. One day she was dressing for a meeting of her church circle and put on a thin voile dress over one of her homemade feed sack slips. Oh boy. I looked at her all dressed up and said, "Mom, you can't wear that dress over that slip. You can read the print right through it. It read 100 pounds net weight. You'll sure get a laugh out of that." Dorothy Kies, Valparaiso, Indiana. That's funny. One day, my mama showed me how to bleach feed sacks so we could make them into clothes. I helped her from that day on, and most feed sacks had only names printed on them, but some came in colors, and red dye was always the hardest to get out. We'd rub Fels Napa soap onto the sacks, scrub them on a washboard, and then boil them in a big tub on the stove. After a thorough rinsing, we soaked them again in bleach and soap. Sometimes even that wasn't enough, and they had to be boiled again to get out the last hint of color. Once the color was gone, the cloth was stamped with designs and embroidered for tea towels or tablecloths. And the first year I was married, I embroidered an applique 12 flour sacks into luncheon cloths for Christmas presents. Mrs. C.R. Leonard, Ridgecrest, California. Back during those hard times, sewing with feed sacks was part of our way of life. We raised only a few chickens, so I had limited number of sacks from which to choose, but a chicken farm a few miles away had more sacks than its owners could use, and they sold the extras for 25 cents each. Not bad for more than a yard of material. Once I found 2 sacks with tiny red flowers sprinkled on a white background. I used these sacks to make a dress for my youngest daughter, and it was quite a sight, trimmed with red rickrack and small red buttons and a sash that tied in the back with a big bow. And one day I had to go into an office in town on business, and my daughter came with me wearing her new dress, and a lady in the office commented on how pretty the dress was. When I said I'd made it from feed sacks, she could barely believe it. She repeated her compliment and then said admiringly, "It is remarkable what some folks can do." I was so pleased that I walked out feeling as though I created a designer original from those 2 lowly feed sacks. Beulah Sutton Waite, Sullivan, Illinois. My folks raised hundreds of chickens, so we had plenty of feed sacks, and my mother used them to make most of my clothes. She used the prints for items like dresses and saved the white ones for those with lettering on them for undergarments. And one day at a family picnic, we kids were turning somersaults on the grass, and suddenly everyone began laughing. I stood up wondering what was going on, and an uncle said to me, "So you're the pride of the Rockies." I didn't understand what he meant until he explained, "That's what it says on your underpants. Embarrassed? You bet." Joyce Coleman, Hotchkiss, Colorado. That's hysterical. Oh my God. As a mother of 9 children, 6 of them girls, my sewing machine was constantly running. Using it, I was able to completely outfit my daughters for school with the aid of those pretty feed sacks. I really felt like a designer, although I used the same pattern over and over, and each dress was a little different, with changes in the necklines and sleeves and trimmings, and the variety of color and designs of those feed sacks seemed limitless. I don't think our daughters ever felt deprived or that they weren't dressed as well as their classmates. In fact, some of the feed sacks could even be used for more fancy attire. The one I remember best was a floral design with a gold thread running through it. I used that pattern to make a party dress for our oldest daughter, and she felt like it was the most beautiful dress in the world. Melba Bender, Sydney, Ohio. Well, guys, that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one. You stay safe. You stay positive. You keep prepping. And as always, fearless. Ciao.